Hello there. What is going on, everyone? Today we are sitting down with Will Shick, Atomic Mass Games head of product development, and we are talking Star Wars, Shatterpoint, and lots of probably some other Star Wars general related talk as well. Will, I want to thank you so much for hanging out with us today. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. The weather's going crazy out my window. It's snowing, so it looks like I'm more in a cave than I was when the sun was out.
Oh my goodness, it's so
But
warm in Orlando, Florida right now. I had to turn the AC down a little bit, so it's strange the
yeah,
contrast between the different parts of the country.
yeah, rub it in. That's fine. That's fine.
Come on down and visit.
I'm
We'd
just
love
gonna
to
watch
have
the
you.
Winter Underlane.
Yes.
Oh,
For people
I'll
who
I'll
don't
get there at
know,
some point.
sorry, for people who don't know who you are or much about Shatterpoint, can you give us the quick elevator pitch of what you do at Atomic Mass Games? I know that's a
Sure.
quick thing. It's a big ask, and a little bit about this latest game, Shatterpoint, that you guys have been hyping
Sure.
up.
So my name's Will Shick. I am the current director of product development for Atomic Mass Games. Originally, I was the head of studio for Atomic Mass Games, so I actually started Atomic Mass as a studio with Dallas, Marco, and Will Pagani. So the four of us began that back like 4.5 years ago, whatever it is now. Feels like it was the other day. I can still remember working in an office where we only had boxes to sit on because we didn't actually have furniture yet.
Oh my goodness.
Um, but so I started as the head of studio, which basically meant that I was kind of the lead on the creative vision and development, as well as a lot of the business side. And then in 2020, end of 2020, early 2021, I don't know, time eludes me so much because I live so much of my life in like 2025 and 2026 land, because our timelines are so long. It's really hard for me to remember what happened in the past, which is pretty bad. But anyway, we were fortunate enough to kind of have this situation where the Star Wars miniatures games transitioned over to Atomic Mass Games, so Armada, X-wing, and Legion. And with that whole transition and kind of reconfiguration of Asmodee Studios, I was able to take on a full-time role as the new product or director of product development, and Simone Elliott took over the head of studio. And part of that whole exchange was the thing that I love to do the most and the thing that I think I'm best at is not necessarily the business and numbers crunching side. It's more of the game development design and kind of just shepherding the process of creating awesome new games. So I was able to kind of step full term into that. And Simone, who had an amazing pedigree in the business side as the licensing director and working with production and all of the things that she's done throughout Asmodee at her over 10 plus year career now. I think she's at 13. I could be a little wrong on that.
Hmm.
A long
It's
time.
it's been a very long
Um,
time. Yes.
it's been a long time. She was just the perfect choice to take over the head of studio role. And because we were, handling now a large portion of Asmodee's LFL license, and she had amazing contacts with LFL during her time as director of licensing and everything, it just kind of it fit really well for what the studio does since we only do licensed games and things like that. So now what I basically do is I get to hang out all day and I get to work with the developers and work on game designs and kind of shepherd the vision for all the different lines through, have conversations and about, what that means for the business. How are we going to try to grow the studio? What are we going to do for the different game lines? What makes sense within the needs of Asmodee, right?
Right.
Because the
Absolutely.
studio ultimately, all of our paychecks get signed by Asmodee. So it's very important that we're working synergistically with them, while making all these fantastic products and games for people to enjoy. And yeah, so I get to look at a lot of artwork. I get to dig through all of like the archives and find reference images, and we get to have a lot of discussions about which character when and what does that mean. And then we quibble over rules wording and all that stuff. So it's very fun. It's very multifaceted, and I get to work with a lot of really great experts in their field, and rely on them a lot to kind of like gut check the different things. But ultimately, I'm kind of the final filter or the funnel that gets everything through. So
Mhm.
everybody has their own idea of what these things should be, could be, and that's one of the really exciting things about working in a creative environment, right? And I think it's one of the things that you definitely see the passion come through on online chat boards and Facebook groups and everything. Like, there's no wrong answer necessarily. when it comes to like what should a character do, how should it function, what should it look like, within the bounds of, obviously you're not going to make Anakin Skywalker a Quarren.
I was
That
about to
doesn't
say
really work.
somebody
But
in the comments section will give us a wrong answer. I'm sure if they try
yeah,
hard enough, you can do it.
you can definitely go completely off the rails.
Yeah.
But if you're kind of maintaining the overall like IP aesthetic and everything,
Right.
there's all the interpretations, right? Which one's the best? That's a classic one that we always have to kind of deal with, is like, okay, which Anakin Skywalker is the best Anakin Skywalker?
Oh goodness.
Episode 2? Is it season 4? Is it season 7? Is it Revenge of the Sith? Is it the new Anakin Skywalker from Obi-Wan when they have that flashback?
That's a good one. That's a really good one.
Yeah. So what are you picking and where are you going? And so a lot of that, it's collaboration and it's discussion, but it also you kind of need the vision and the idea of this is where we're going and this is how we're going to get there, and we will get to these things, but this is kind of the order in which we're going to go. And so that's a lot of what I do.
Sure.
In addition to kind of spearheading new game design and things like that, because that's a big part of it, is determining, okay, where is there space in the market? What are we not doing with the properties that we could? What are current audiences or audiences that we're not hitting? Like how can we get those? Because we want, at the end of the day, Atomic Mass Games' real passion and mission statement is to bring as many people as we can into the hobby tabletop, environment. Yeah. We want to share these amazing games that many of us have spent more than half of our lives playing and engaging with and spending money to go to conventions. And I've got my whole like one shelf of miniatures behind me here that's just loaded full, and there's a garage full of them, right? Mm-hmm. How do we share that? How do we bring those people in? Because the thing that we all really want is we want people to have the same enjoyment and excitement about these things that we've had. We want to share that passion. And I think that's one of the things about any hobby that's really amazing. And part of the reason why I love what we get to do so much is that hobbyists are passionate individuals. They don't just want to do the thing. They typically want to share the thing, right? Mm-hmm. The best joy that you have typically, I find, as a hobbyist and playing miniatures games and tabletop is just teaching somebody else how to do it, is seeing them get the same passion and excitement and drive that you have initially. And so that really for us is kind of like what drives us, what motivates a lot of our decisions and our choices. And, of course, if you're doing that properly, then you're going to continue to see success as a business as well, because we always have to remember that at the end of the day, as much as we love doing what we do, I can't feed my kids if I'm not getting paid. And so that, everything kind of goes under that lens as well, right? It is a job, and it is something that, like many jobs, you have good days, you have bad days. And the best part about my bad days is that I get to go, man, that was really rough. I've had a really bad day over tiny 35 millimeter Star Wars characters. And I go, but I had a really bad day over 35 millimeter Star Wars characters. So is it really all that bad?
It's a good problem to have. I mean, you guys have had a lot of success with Marvel Crisis Protocol. That was actually the first time we met when you guys unveiled Marvel Crisis Protocol at Gen Con, I think 2019. Was that? That was before before the COVID,
Gen Con
before
2019.
Everything changed. And and that's obviously led into Shatterpoint. We knew that you guys were working on more stuff behind the scenes, and we finally got the big unveil of this not too long ago, and the world is going to see it a lot sooner, later this month at Adepticon. You guys are going to have. Can you tell us about what you guys are going to have at Adepticon? Is it just going to be a bunch of demo tables? People have to sign up. How is that going to work?
Yeah, so I know an article is going to go up kind of talking about the process of how you can make sure that you get your demo at Adepticon, but we're going to have several demo tables going. We're going to have an amazing staff of demoers, and basically it's going to be people's first chance to really get their hands on the game and test out the game mechanics.
Right.
So there's not going to be any like full game playthroughs or any events like that, right? It's just purely the demo experience. So very much what we did at that 2019 Gen Con when we unveiled our first game, which was Marvel Crisis Protocol. It'll give everyone kind of the chance to see the culmination of all of the marketing teases that we've been giving people through our fantastic marketing department about how the game plays. This will be the moment where it all comes together and you're going to see it in all of its glory all at once.
And that's going to be
And so
big
I'm very
for a lot of
excited for
people
that.
too. Yeah, I've seen
Oh yeah.
so much of my users' feedback is like, "Hey, this game is up for pre-order, but I haven't seen the gameplay yet. What is going on? How can they expect me to pre-order?" And I'm like, "Well, they've already said from the beginning that in March at Adepticon you'll see all of the gameplay." I also want to preface anybody watching too with I've got a lot of questions about Shatterpoint, and I've had them for a while. And you guys have been releasing articles. You've been dropping breadcrumbs on us, and so some of the questions I have have kind of already been covered, or at least partially been covered. So I'll still double back on some of those, but I've got a lot I want to talk to you about. This game looks really exciting, though. I guess I want to start off with maybe a softball question. I don't know if this is going to be a hard question or a tough question, but as soon as you guys announced this, I said, you know what? That's a book on my reading list that I have not gotten to yet, and it's a Shatterpoint book. And so I'm curious if the Shatterpoint book from the Legends influenced this or not, or really what led to the name Star Wars Shatterpoint.
So the book did have an impact. We were aware of the book.
It's a cool name too.
So yeah. Well, one, it's a very exciting name, right? So one of the worst things you have to do as I think a game maker or anything, honestly, is title something, right? Because it's your first impression. So you kind of have to convey, or ideally you have to convey a lot about what the game is, what the experience is through the title. And so they're always very difficult. And of course, you have to make sure that like a lot of people like them. So we talked about how, so many things in creative development are subjective, and there are many different ways to do things correctly. And how do you figure out which way it's right? Titles are the worst because everyone's got an opinion, and everyone has different feelings on things. So we were going through the naming process basically around the same time. I mean, a lot of things happen concurrently, but we had to pick a finalized title at the point before we could do like the box logo and all the treatments and everything. And so of course we had been working on the game development for quite some time, and everything gets a very fancy code name whenever we do things. Usually they're food related. Sometimes they're more ridiculous. And sometimes they're very basic. So our code name, which you'll probably hear me fall into a couple of times when talking about Shatterpoint, because it still feels very alien on my tongue, was Fulcrum.
Okay. That's a great name.
Shatterpoint. Yeah. Shatterpoint originally was project code name Fulcrum. So everything we talked about internally was to call the game Fulcrum. But we had reached the point where we could no longer call it Fulcrum because that wasn't going to be the final title. We needed a new title. As serendipity would have it, I guess, we were also working on Mace Windu right around that time. And for those folks who have watched our mini extravaganza panels or just kind of like seen our game streams or anything like that, our Marvel art director, Josh Cologne, is like the biggest Mace Windu fan I've ever met.
Okay.
To the point that when we went out to visit LFL one time, his only request was, could you please bring me back anything Mace Windu? He didn't care what it was. There's not a ton of Mace Windu things, but that's kind of why he's voracious for it. So I guess early spoiler alert, Mace Windu in the game shockingly has an ability called Shatterpoint.
Oh, wonderful. I love it.
Who would have guessed?
I probably would have guessed, but yeah, that's a great thing to hear. Yeah.
And Josh was super insistent that, Shatterpoint would really make sense. And he was going into all the things about Shatterpoints and everything else. And we had a couple of other titles that we thought would work really well. They wound up not getting through for various reasons. The other problem with titles is that you have to make sure that no one else has used the title because of all that nonsensical legal stuff that you have to worry about when you're a business and things like that. So unfortunately, our top picks that we thought were kind of like shoo-ins because they were doing the thing, they didn't wind up working out. And so we went back kind of to the discussion board. And Josh will never let me forget this, but I was sitting there in the meeting and I was like, well, what if we just called it Shatterpoint? And I was like, because, we want the game to be about these seminal moments in the character stories, and they're all about players determining, like clutching victory through the jaws of fate, and you don't have a lot of control, as folks are finding out in the game, right? There's a lot of like randomness and chance, and the idea is to replicate that idea or that feeling from animated cartoons where like you see in the Clone Wars or in Rebels, where the characters are really, they've got their backs to the wall and they have to come up with some heroics to get their way out.
Right.
The plan never goes to plan. So the idea of the Shatterpoint did really make sense. I'll give it to Josh. It probably should have been at the top of the list. I love it now. I think it was because
hindsight's 2020. So
he was right. So now it's on video, and he knows that he was right. He had the best name choice.
You did a great job, Josh. Good job.
Yeah, because once I really started digging into it, we started talking about it. I was like, this makes a lot of sense for the game. It really fits what we're talking about. We had the wild card at the time, which was just called the wild card, but the Shatterpoint card,
yes. Yeah.
It was like it was meant to be, and we just had to work our way to it. And somebody was smart enough to figure it out from the start, and that was Josh.
I've got questions about the Shatterpoint card too, but those come a little later. I don't want to jump. Sure. I don't want to jump too far ahead. But when creating this game, I look at all of the characters when you first unveiled it, and I'm thinking to myself, I saw Maul, and I'm like, okay, wait, this could be anything. And I saw Ahsoka, and she's kind of that older Ahsoka, but not too old, so kind of fit. But then as you started seeing more and more of the preview, it's like, okay, these are all characters from like the Clone Wars era, and then as we got more and more, I'm like, okay, is this a Clone Wars era exclusive game? But now we're kind of based on some of the stuff you guys have leaked, it seems like it might not be, but at least at launch, it's definitely going to be using characters from the Clone Wars. Now, was that something from the beginning that you said we want to do Clone Wars specific stuff, or like did kind of what went into that process? How is that something that you knew from the beginning?
Yeah, no, it was very intentional. Like when I originally did the game design and wrote up the design briefs and documents, which I then, presented to Pagani, and we start our little discussions and everything, and talking with the creative aspects like Dallas and Simone and stuff, like when I pitched the game to Simone as well, in terms of like what we wanted to do with Star Wars. The Clone Wars was the number one because for a number of reasons. Like, I'm an OG trilogy guy. I grew up, my first Star Wars experience was watching A New Hope on primetime, like CBS or whatever the one of three stations played it, in 1986 or 7, I think. Mm-hmm. I watched it on a tiny like tube TV.
Oh yeah, I remember sitting down, cross-legged on the floor in front of that TV and just being in awe.
Spilled my Frosted Flakes when the Bantha came out because I thought that was the coolest thing ever, and everyone kept telling me it was a Wookiee, and I was like, that's not what I mean. I mean the other thing. But like those movies, they have amazing characters, but they are pretty narrow in scope, right? The Galactic Civil War, for the most part, you have kind of the tale of those characters, and there's a lot of versions of those characters you can do, but in terms of just how much ground you have to cover, or like the visionary scope of all of the things that you could do with it, the Clone Wars was the place. And there's so many great characters that we have seen because of the world building that's been done in the Clone Wars animated series, throughout the movies and everything else, and especially when comparing to some of like specifically, the most direct example is Star Wars Legion. You're looking for kind of an experience that builds within the catalog of Star Wars games that exist. How does it offer something different? Who is it kind of aimed for? What's the experience, right? The thing that always makes me laugh is when everyone's like, but we already have Legion. And it's like, well, sure. You also have vanilla ice cream, but if you walk into Baskin Robbins, you're going to find 31 other flavors of ice cream, right? Just because one exists doesn't mean that that there can't be others, and that they can't offer something that's a different experience while still being effectively the same base form, right? Which is a miniatures game in this instance. And so Legion, not only does it have a very macro level, right? It's about big armies. The characters exist within it. You have your Luke Skywalkers, your Darth Vaders. But the characters themselves are not the focus of the experience. They're not what the game is necessarily about. The game is about mass scale army actions in the Star Wars galaxy.
I think I've been waiting for something like this too, because I've often homebrewed my own version of Legion that just throws all the troops away, and it's just like, just heroes versus villains. And so when I saw this, I'm like, this could hit on a lot of notes that Legion doesn't hit on. and it can can give you the opportunities to in a formalized game setting take a lot of concepts that Legion doesn't have, and allow you to do that. And by the way, probably on a a smaller scale, because it's not 6x3, it's 3x3, right? And so I'm also guessing it probably plays a little quicker than a full game of Star Wars Legion, on average. I mean, not every game is going to be the same length, but
definitely depends on player skill and your comfort with the game. But for the most part, it's about half the time of a standard game of Star Wars Legion.
Right.
And it can get down to be a lot quicker depending on, again, how fast players are with it. I think on the box we said it's like 90 minutes to 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you always kind of assume like learning the game, being semi unfamiliar with it, you always want to give people a realistic expectation. But yeah, so the Clone Wars, because of that, because we knew that we have this macro level game, but we really want the micro level. We want to dive in and we want to see those characters doing what those characters would do on a Saturday morning cartoon, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of the influences were, looking at and imagining what if we had the Clone Wars animated series, but it had been done in the heyday of like our youth, basically.
Right.
If it had been done in the late 80s, the early 90s, the era of that really amazing kind of hand-drawn animation that sparks so many of the nostalgic and incredible things that we as adults now like look back on as nostalgia. And so the Clone Wars gave us that level of characters, that really deep breadth and catalog of people who also probably would never make it to Legion. Like, really, on an infinite timeline, sure, but when you talk about what is most critical to Legion, it's not necessarily the characters themselves. Like, the characters are important, they're cool to see on the table, but they're not what the game is about. The game is about mass army combat. So units have to be kind of your primary, like, look, vehicles have to be very important.
You can't just do operatives and commanders forever, whereas in Shatterpoint, you can be like, all right, who's that obscure Jedi that you wanted, or that background character? Now all of a sudden, we can do that, or you can do that. Not we can. I'm not working on it. Although I got some ideas.
The other okay. You just throw them up. We're always looking at the Facebook groups and stuff.
Oh yeah.
Like we take our cues. You'll see if we like your idea, we'll probably, and we haven't already started on it, you'll see it in about 3 years, because that's how long it takes. So it's not fast.
Speaking of 3 years, too, you guys have so many different. I feel like with what we've seen so far, you have planned this game out to have a long future. Because of, we talked about the Clone Wars and the eras, but once we started to see, when you guys did the unboxing and we talked about like, wait a second, why is there a Republic symbol on this B1? I think it was you that clarified that's an era symbol. And so we learned about eras. You talked a little bit about eras and how that you'll within a particular squad you're gonna they'll be locked to an era, but you can still mix and match. If you have 2 squads in your strike force, I hope I'm getting the terms right? Like, so basically your build will, like, half of it will will have to be locked to one era, and the other one can either be the same era or possibly a different era. And that just opened up so many questions, because you guys have even talked about, like, you used some examples of like Darth Vader and Leia and Luke and things like that. I'm like, well, so there's a lot of potential here. Like, what can you elaborate on what some of the thoughts are, and like, how are you locking into any specific eras, or are we thinking maybe someday Mando and stuff like that?
Well, so honestly, the goal is always to make sure that the game is as inclusive and open-ended as possible, right? Because there's lots of great things throughout all of the different eras of Star Wars. There are things that, again, with the Clone Wars, the one last bit that was really important to us zeroing in on that was not just its breadth of characters, but also because we knew visually that we wanted to create this kind of animated different look. And it's much more difficult to take things that don't exist in animation, to take the original movies and then try to interpret them with a lens of like, this is what our animated stylization would look like. Whereas with the Clone Wars, because of the really great amount of Clone Wars stuff that existed, right? There's already this kind of established animation. We were able to kind of take cues from that and then reapply our stylistic filter to create something new visually for the game. But it was like less of a jump, right? Because we were going from one animation style to a different animation style. And we didn't necessarily have to worry about like, well, what are the important visual likeness features that Hayden Christensen has to have when you make an animated version of Anakin? Because we had an example of that.
Right.
So we knew sort of what the important bits were to make Anakin a correct Anakin, but we could interpret those in a different way with a different kind of animation style. And so that was another really big point to it, is because we really wanted to push boundaries as much as we could with LFL, and they were amazing partners in working with us on that, because we wanted to create, an expression that was something that we desperately had wanted to see when we were younger, and then we felt like that was going to make a really interesting and compelling and distinct game as well. So when it came to eras, we hit that, but the biggest thing in general is I love games that kind of harken back to the action figures of my youth.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't feel like you need to put rails on people if the rails don't do anything useful. And when it comes to, your interpretation of Star Wars, even when you sit down to play a game of Legion, or especially when you sit down to play a game of Shatterpoint, the story that you're going to tell with your opponent is yours to tell.
Mm-hmm.
It's not on rails necessarily. Like, we're giving you the game rules, we're giving you the units and kind of the structure with which to tell your story, to play your game.
Yes.
But the experience should be yours. When you get a coloring book, they don't tell you, like, the coloring book doesn't reject the blue crayon for Vader if you want a blue Vader.
Right.
It doesn't stop you from making Luke redheaded if you prefer, or giving him an orange lightsaber.
In the Clone Wars did we see unlikely team-ups? I saw, Asajj Ventress
Mm-hmm.
team up with Obi-Wan Kenobi. I saw Dooku team up with Anakin and Obi-Wan in one of the episodes. Or you have some lovely characters like Hondo Anaka, who will work for anybody if the money's right.
Mm-hmm.
So you have so many strange one-off episodes that could be part of your story. I mean, when I've played Marvel Crisis Protocol, a lot of times we always try to make it narrative, and so it's always like, well, why is Captain America teaming up with Omega Red? Well, maybe it was at the United Nations, and then they're trying to stop this other greater threat, or something like that, right? And so that's and of course, if you want to stick to strictly a canonical list, then of course you can absolutely do that. But I really like, that's one of the things that really got my interest, and when you guys announced that would be that mixing matching kind of list building, I thought that was actually fantastic.
I think it's all about choice, right? And it's about giving players choices that they can use to engage with the property and the characters that we love in whatever way you want. And the thing is like, especially in a character focused game like this, we want people to be able to play with the characters that they most identify with. So if you happen to love Dooku and you happen to love Obi-Wan, if the game doesn't require it, why would I stop you from being able to do that as a player, right?
Sure.
Now, importantly, we also give you, we also create the games to function canonically. We show and express the game primarily through its canonical roots. But the option and the opportunity is there because it can be. And that, I think, is really important, because at the end of the day, games are meant to be played, and play is meant to be creative, expressive, and fun. And the way in which you do that is by giving people as many options as you can that fit within the bounds of things. And we can talk more if we want to. I'd
love to talk
about how that system of, like, okay, you can mix and match whatever you want, but there are going to be benefits to not doing that necessarily. Or if you want to play a true expression, there are very apparent and good benefits to doing that. So even within the idea of, like, you can mix and match whatever you want, we're always looking at the thing of, like, well, what you don't want is people to take that freedom of choice, that creativity, and turn it into a min-maxing system.
Right.
Like, okay, well, I'll just take the best, like, I'll just number crunch it, and I'll say, these things are the top, so I just take these things, and then we're fine.
Well, that's why you have some of the, I'm assuming that's why you have some of the, you have like a partial limitations on it. Like, you still have to have, a leader, a lieutenant, and then kind of like your troops, and also the era limitations within a squad, because maybe I could take, Darth Vader someday, and then Kylo Ren from, like, if we're jumping really far, into the timeline, or mix match with somebody from, like, if we go the opposite direction, maybe the High Republic or whatever. I'm just picking all these different eras at random, but I think that's really cool, but also at the same time, I gotta think that, you know, having like this era system, it's got to give you some design freedom, because if you, let's just say you wanted to do Rey and Finn from the sequel trilogy, you know, and then some Resistance fighters or something like that. Well, now all of a sudden you don't have to, like, if you were to try to do that with Legion, you'd have to build a whole faction around them. You've got to have like you know, 5 different list metas ready to go for this new faction on launch day. And you know, and that's a tremendous amount of work versus, hey, I just need a single squad pack, so now I can cherry pick, and now I can, you know, do something like this. And I imagine that gives you a lot more freedom to kind of get some of the characters that you want to get, but would be prohibited because of like a meta requirement, you know.
Yeah, the scope. I mean, the scopes of the game are very different, right? And that mixing and matching freedom does allow us to kind of like dabble our toes in different things. The important bit is that we're able to do that because the way in which Shatterpoint is built, the kind of experience that Shatterpoint wants to give you, allows for that, right? Legion, again, kind of comparing and contrasting the game experiences and why these two things really don't overlap in the Venn diagram outside of like they share Star Wars and some characters. The Legion experience is very different, right? It's all about building that army, about those unit synergies, about creating your perfect strategic and tactical kind of like machine, and then performing that on the tabletop as your opponent tries to mess with you and fighting back and forth. To do that, because of the larger macro scope of that game, you need a lot more stuff, as you point out, right? You need
exactly
these differences in these things. Whereas with Shatterpoint, because of the more micro view level and the fact that it's focused on the characters and their abilities, you don't have to worry so much about, well, you have to have a fully baked out Resistance identity and faction, right?
Right.
Because those things don't exist. Now, what eras do allow us to do is you can't infinitely make new rules, right? There is, at some point, there is a moment at which you have covered all the ground there is to cover, and it usually takes a long time. But eventually, you know, you're going to make something that's the same as something else. And one of the things that the eras allow us to do that's important is you can make, you know, your 501st clones, and then maybe someday in the far, far future, you make your Resistance fighters. And those two things can fill similar roles on the tabletop.
Right.
But because they are important to different eras, and therefore they unlock certain characters like a Rey or a Finn or whatever, based on how the game squads are built and how your strategies are, those two things are not necessarily competing directly for the same space.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
So the question isn't, well, I'll take the 501st because they do what the Resistance fighters want to do better. It's, if I want to take Rey, I'm going to look at I'm going to look at that era's worth of stuff.
Exactly.
And if I want to take Anakin, I'm going to look at the Clone Wars era of stuff. And so it allows it, basically it future proofs in some ways the fact that there isn't a finite amount of expressions that you can have, and eventually you will have things that are like similar, right?
Yeah.
And so that's important. The bigger thing, though, is not so much the eras in terms of like when we go back to the mix and match min-maxing versus the canonical expressions, right? The biggest, I think, element, which is talked about in that first gameplay article, maybe it was in the list building. It's in the list building article. It's mentioned. I guess it's the very first article. Is the unit tags. And so one of the really fun things as we started developing and designing the game is the original design document that I kind of laid out, my idea for how we promote and synergize certain things to work together well was by having all of the abilities, or having a number of the abilities, synergized through tags. So for example, you know, you'll see that like all of the light side stuff, all the Anakin and Ahsoka stuff, are in the box. A lot of it's Galactic Republic. The Mandalorians aren't; they're Mandalorians. But you know, Ahsoka, Rex, the 501st, and Anakin are all Galactic Republic. And then you have Separatist Alliance on the other side for many of the things, and you have Mandalorians for others. Right in the core box experience, you get to see kind of how the tag system, how interesting and fun the tag system can be to building thematic and still player choice armies. Right. So when you look at a lot of the abilities, they'll say this can affect an allied X, Y, or Z thing, or it can affect a Galactic Republic clone trooper. And that ability only works on a character that has that tag. So if you want to make sure that you're maximizing kind of your abilities and your ability or your chances to utilize those abilities throughout the course of the game, the more of those tags you include, the more synergistic you're going to be. And of course, things that have those tags also have abilities that reference those tags.
Sure.
So,
yeah. And it gives you hooks into future clones too.
Yeah.
Like we see Obi-Wan is going to be coming with some clones as well. And while those are probably going to fit quite nicely into maybe a thematic list. So, one would speculate,
So one of the things, like one of the examples of this is the Mandalorians, which is many of the Mandalorians have abilities that key off of other Mandalorians that allow them to basically make an extra jump out of activation, or to gain like extra actions and abilities when they wind up close to each other. The clone troopers have an ability in the box called coordinated fire, and this is replicated through all the clone trooper troops.
Okay.
So the more clone trooper tags that you have, the more opportunities you have to use this coordinated fire, which is basically they get to apply a condition on top of something that's being attacked by another person who matches the tag, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that gives players that added oomph when they're like, well, I won't take the best of whatever. I want to play Galactic Republic stuff. I really love the clones. So you get you get these small bonuses for playing within a theme, playing within the thing. And then there are abilities that don't have as many tags or they're more broad in their base. You have characters like Maul who literally does not care.
Sure.
Everything he does, he just does. He's like, I don't care who I'm working with. It doesn't really matter. I'm just going to go kill you with my lightsaber.
And that's a great way for you to apply theme as well as mechanics. I imagine you're with these tags, how they're kind of hooks in for good abilities. I imagine you've also given yourself the ability to make them tags for potentially enemy abilities. Like if you're a droid trooper, maybe I've got a weapon that works really well against droids. So maybe I want a varied list. Maybe I don't want all droids because that might give me a big weakness against certain archetypes or what have you. I think it gives you that options to do things like that with that system, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you'll see exactly that right out of the core box because the Asajj Ventress actually has an ability that tags off of Jedis.
Oh, so goodness. All right.
Well, that sounds very exciting. All of that stuff is there, right? It was a really fun system to like work on and design and kind of look at it from a little bit of a list building aspect and to allow players the freedom and flexibility to do, whatever their Star Wars dreams were within the only limitation of your squad has to be eras and your squad has to follow the squad building rules, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well.
So, speaking of
also
squad building,
give them carrots and rewards.
Okay. Yeah. So squad building question. So this was one that I had was a bigger question before the article, but we've kind of got it partially answered in that you have that leader, that lieutenant, and then your troops. And so my initial question was going to be like, how many models is going to be typical for a build? And it looks like with the core set you're getting 2 full builds, so you can play a complete game against a friend all in one core set. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so the basic idea behind the core set is that it's a great way for you and a friend to learn how to play, to kind of like get your feet under yourselves for the games of Shatterpoint. Ultimately, because of how the squad building works, and I think really with the different combinations that you can create through the different squads that are included in the core set, especially with the way the Mandalorians on both sides kind of can work together to create this Mandalorian force that's pretty neat on the tabletop. Every player will probably want their own core set, right?
Sure.
So there's always that kind of like, it's a great way to like sit down and be like, hey, I just got Shatterpoint, Crabbok. Let's sit down and let's learn it together.
Oh, let's do that. And I'm flying out to Seattle right now.
This is super cool. I love this. Like, what do I need to do? I'll go get my own core set, right?
Sure.
You can split it, of course, if you want to, and you're for sure that you want only these 2 squads out of it. That's always an option. But really, again, because of the squad flexibility and the customization aspects, we wanted to give players the opportunity right out of the box to be able to start to list build and dabble.
Okay.
Because I think that's one of the really fun things about the game. It's one of the things that becomes really exciting as you like jump into it. I mean, the second that you see somebody, we've done a lot of behind the scenes demo games with folks in Asmodee and stuff. And one of my favorite parts is as you start to walk them through the game, they start to understand how the system works. Inevitably, the first question that you almost always get is, well, wait, so if I took those Mandalorians over there and I put them in my squad, they would work with these? And
Yeah.
it's like, yes, that's exactly how it would work. And
Nice.
then they
Yeah.
get really excited and they're like, why wouldn't I do that? That's amazing. And I'm
I
like,
always
because I
find
want to lead you to this point.
when you're learning a new game, there's like this aha moment where like the rules,
Mhm.
like maybe the first third of the time, you're trying to process too many instructions all at once or whatever, and then it all just it clicks and it starts to like, and then the eyes get wide, and then you're like, okay,
Mhm.
okay, and I see that that's probably one of those moments for this game. I'm really eager to see like full gameplay, and as it gets closer to Adepticon. Of course, it also comes with a lot of terrain, and I know you guys have shown off some of this
Mhm.
terrain. I think it's more terrain than we've ever seen, like in a core set before. Legion has some barricades. Marvel Crisis Protocol had a fairly nice amount of terrain, but this one has
Mhm.
a lot more, and that's goes into one of my other questions: is that elevation? You guys have said that elevation plays a really big part of this game. It looks like there's a tool I think it's called the shove tool that you guys have talked about in an article.
Mhm.
Looks like it deals with elevation. What can you tell us about elevation as it applies to Shatterpoint, if it's not too spoilery?
Sure. So, again, going back to kind of the original vision for the game, which was to replicate those really exciting moments that we see in Star Wars media where characters are battling out desperately. You have, Obi-Wan versus Anakin on Mustafar. You have all of the great different duels that happen in the Clone Wars series. Asajj versus Luminara and Ahsoka inside the Venator.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's hard to remember a Star Wars battle that doesn't have a gantry.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I think Obi-Wan versus Vader on the Death Star in New Hope, right? No gantry technically, but there is like a
It's
docking platform
Gantry-esque.
elevator that's
It's
kind of
Gantry.
low.
I'm thinking
Um,
of Kanan Jarrus versus the Grand Inquisitor.
sure, yeah.
Another great, one of my favorite duels. But yes, that's
So
very
like
iconic.
so yeah, so visually when you imagine these scenes, when you think about these grandiose things, you always think of kind of gantries. You think of elevation. You think of jumping up and down and climbing up different things. So we knew we really wanted to get that kind of that dynamic movement, that kinetic kind of like visual in there. And we wanted to really set the stage for your Star Wars battlefield. And terrain is one of the most important things to do that in a tabletop miniatures game because we get to play on 3D environments.
Oh yeah.
And so providing players the tools that they need, the materials that they need, i.e. terrain, to do that is really important. And then once you know you're going to do that, you want to make sure that the terrain is really important in the game, right? In Crisis Protocol, terrain is really important because it's interactive. You can pick it up, you can throw it, it causes damage, it can explode, all of that different stuff. In Shatterpoint, terrain really is important because it defines, in many ways, the engagement, the duels. You're going to see as more information is revealed on combat. We might talk about that a little bit,
Mhm.
but Shatterpoint has a very unique combat system
Okay.
compared to like a Legion or even a Crisis Protocol. The the vast majority of the narrative of the game is told through how combat unfolds on the battlefield. The design goal was always to make combat actions feel like a duel on screen. So there's a lot of kinetic movement that happens. That's where that shove tool actually comes in. Is
Okay.
that it's there to aid players as they like duke it out and they knock people back with their lightsabers or their blaster fire, and then they riposte and they come back. It just makes those measurements a bit easier. And every shove in the game is basically 1 inch, so it's a 1 inch tool. Elevation is also really important because of how the objectives get placed and the fact that if you're on different elevation than the objective, you can't score it. If you're on top of elevation, you can negate defense bonuses like cover. Of course, if you're on elevation, you get cover and all these different things.
So you want to have the high
So
ground.
you definitely want to have the high ground. It's
Oh,
it's very important to have.
now I understand
And
why
the
all
game,
after all these years. All right.
yeah, and the game itself and the mechanics around it, um, it creates tension. It creates more tactical like decision making points because of how terrain and objective scoring and all of those things interplay together.
Okay.
You can't lightsaber somebody who's higher than you, right? You cannot melee engage somebody who is on a higher elevation than you. So if I need to get away from Maul, I can hopefully push him off the gantry,
Mm.
and then I'm no longer engaged by him because he can't reach me. So
Okay.
now I'm free to go about my turn without necessarily maybe suffering the penalties from trying to disengage with him, which is slower speed. Some characters like Maul can deal damage to you as you run away and things like that.
Okay. Yeah, those attacks of
So
opportunity that a lot of games
yeah,
have can be pretty punishing if you just decide to like turn your back on your opponent and run away.
and Shatterpoint doesn't have like a full attack of opportunity, but it does have negatives in it that are inbuilt for when you get engaged. You can lock people in place better. You can slow them down. The biggest thing is with objective scoring, obviously, like not being able to score the objective if you're on a different elevation as it, and your opponent has characters that are on that elevation, becomes a really big point of the game. So the elevation plays into the story as well as just setting the stage for a really iconic kind of Star Wars experience. And so all of that kind of came together to really create the game that we were hoping to provide that cinematic experience.
So speaking of terrain, also we did some little comparisons with Marvel Crisis Protocol and the terrain there, and I thought it was really cool how dynamic it was that you can throw things. In this one, can I be kind of like Palpatine, and can I throw the Senate at my opponent? Are you going to be able to actually throw terrain at people? I mean, you've got the Force. Is that something that you can do in Shatterpoint?
No, there's no throwing or destroying of terrain in Shatterpoint.
Okay.
Again, when you kind of you look at the complexity levels, we always talk about complexity budget is one of my favorite things to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And you can set your budget for whatever you want. But the higher it goes, the less likely you're going to get a lot of people, right? Because a lot of people they want to be able to quickly understand and play and engage with a game. So identifying where to spend your complexity points basically becomes, I think, one of the key fundamentals to good game design. And as I kind of like referenced a little bit before, where a lot of that complexity budget went was to our goals to make combat in this game feel not like really anything else out there.
So stop throwing the Senate at me and get down here and fight, because that's what people paid for.
And get down there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
okay.
Because the other thing to it too is that once you start talking about light side versus dark side and who actually throws things at people and who actually just pushes people really hard, you start to get into this thing where it's like there wouldn't be a lot of characters canonically that would actually throw the Senate at you. In fact, there's like 2.
Yeah, not that many. Yeah.
So why spend the complexity on that, right? When you can do it.
Your Mandalorians aren't going to be able to do that, and you've got so many clones and Mandalorians that we've seen already that would make a lot more sense. Yeah, that's a good explanation, actually. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about combat. I know that there's articles that are going to be coming out, maybe some that have come out before this video goes live. So forgive any of the questions that maybe are over answered already or not answered. But this game has both, unlike Marvel Crisis Protocol, this game has both offensive and defensive dice. And it looks like, from what I've seen, it looks like there aren't blanks on the dice. What can you tell us about how combat works that you haven't already? I mean, you talked a little bit about it, but
yeah. So I don't want to spoil too much because there is an article that's coming. But effectively, the goal with the combat in Shatterpoint was, again, we went through a lot of iterations in order to try to get as dynamic and interactive a duel feel as we could.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We wanted to see how far we could push our design and development to create something that kind of mimicked what you see when characters are dueling on screen, whether that's through blaster fire and kind of like shooting back and forth and trying to drive people from cover and cover ground and all of that stuff, or the iconic moments where you're clashing with sabers and fighting on those gantries and trying to defeat your opponent. So part of that was that, looking at the probabilities and everything else, having defense dice that were different from the attack dice allows us to really manipulate and create interesting tactical questions for characters and kind of control probabilities in ways that are important to like get the effects that you want. And that's really where Will Pagani and his team of developers come in. They're very crunchy. It's not only how do you write rules language that's very clear and concise, that is hopefully as airtight as it possibly can be, but it's also a lot of Excel data crunching.
Okay.
You want randomness to be part of these games because randomness is exciting, right? Mm-hmm. Being able to completely flub a roll or to completely succeed at a roll, those are the moments you remember. It's
and
not
that
like
can add to your story too. Like, why
Exactly.
did you miss that shot? You had him dead to rights, and you're like, oh well, I was thinking about when they threw the Senate at me or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But importantly,
Mm-hmm.
in order to balance the games, in order to make the game experience fun and functional, and make sure that characters are within a certain band of balance with each other, you also have to be able to like look at the probability and say, okay, on average, this amount of dice versus this amount of dice does this.
Right.
So we do have two different stats. One of the big things that you're going to see in the stat card article, which I think will be the one that'll come out probably right before this, is that characters are composed of two cards. There's a stat card, which you all have seen several times now. It's the one that has the fancy art. It's got the point values for the characters. It's got the force value for the character. And it's got, so far it's been all blurred out, but I think they finally unblur it this next article. But it has all of the character abilities. So the stat card is really what defines the character as the character, right? This is where you see, what abilities they bring to the table, the force powers for the Jedi, the command abilities for the clone commanders, the leadership or the identities of the primary characters and things like that. It's the part that says, okay, this is what makes this character special and unique. It's what defines this as what we think of, right? And that's the part where we as designers and developers are looking at it saying, okay, General Anakin Skywalker, what does he do?
Right.
And then we say, we think he does all these things. And then we say, how does he do it? And then we write rules language for it. And we come up with the things that work.
Okay.
The second part to the characters themselves, or the units, if I'm using proper Shatterpoint terminology, I should be saying units, but it sounds always weird to refer to them as units because they are characters.
Well, they're both.
We're talking about the units. Yeah. They're both, yes. So the units in Shatterpoint, you have your unit stat card, and then you have your unit stance card. And so there's been a lot of speculation about the stance card. What does it exactly
It's actually
mean?
like two questions down on my list. Yeah, can we talk about stance cards a little bit, which I think feeds right into this.
Yeah, it's important because it directly feeds right into this question, which is that the stance card, so we have the stat card, which says this is who the character is, this is what they do. But in Star Wars especially, when you really boil it down, and smarter people than me have talked about this, combat, the duels, the personal fights in Star Wars are just as important to telling you who the character is, to telling you what the story is, as the character's actions and dialogue themselves, right? Okay. So it was super important when we talk about wanting this game to have a high combat focus, wanting it to make combat feel very cinematic like we see on the screen, that characters' combat abilities become really zoomed in. So we go to a micro level, almost like we do with the character stat card. Every character has a stance card. Primary units have a double-sided stance card, so they can actually change their fighting style throughout the game.
Okay.
Most other characters do not. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, if you're a secondary or a supporting character, you just have one side of your stance card. Each stance card is unique to the character. So, for example, like if you're Anakin Skywalker, you have your Gem So and you have your Form Shen, right? He can switch between those two, and they do very different things. His Form 5 Gem So is like very aggro. He's going to finish you off, and he's going to do a lot of damage doing it. His other side, more defensive, so his defenses get a boost. His attack dice go down. But he also is more tactical with it. So instead of dealing a lot of damage, he'll shove you around a lot. Like he'll push you. Okay. So I can get you off the objective point so I can score it. But it's at the expense of maybe just straight out murdering you.
Whereas like the 501st, will they also have even the troopers have one?
So the 501st clones have a stance card. Every single unit in the game has its own unique stance card. Okay. So the 501st clone stance card is very different from the 212 clone stance card that comes with the Obi-Wan box. Okay. So the 501st stance card is very focused on like supporting fire and dealing out special conditions and stuff, so that they're basically there to improve the chances of your other characters to be able to do damage and to really, they hinder your opponent, but they're not necessarily there to like eliminate your opponent. I understand. The 212, on the other hand, their stance card, because they have the longer rifle like DC-15s, they're all about sniping. So they don't do a lot, but they deal a lot of damage if they can get down their chart. And each stance card Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So let me ask you, like, kind of a follow up. When you say every character is going to have their own stance card, what about a character like Ahsoka that we know has two versions coming out? Would Padawan Ahsoka be able to use the same stance card as our older Ahsoka, or is she going to have a stance card that's unique to her?
Nope. Each stance card is unique to the character
Okay.
because the way in which those characters fight is very specific to the point in time
Mm.
that character we're trying to capture is.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, it's not unlikely to say that if you look at characters as they evolve or as you do more and more versions of them, that you won't see similarities between stances,
Mhm.
right?
Sure. Sure.
Or that you'll see like the same trees. But in the end, you can't take one Ahsoka stance card and put it on a different Ahsoka.
Okay. Well, that probably
They're
that
locked
allows you
right
to
into
create
the
a version of the character that can probably prevent some certain min maxing and stuff like that. Like, oh, we can't do another Luke Skywalker because this other Luke Skywalker stance is so OP. If we put it on a different Luke Skywalker, it could break everything or whatever. You know. Yeah.
Yeah, you want
Allows you to
the thing about
compartmentalize a character.
and the thing about Shatterpoint and the way in which it approaches characters
Hmm.
is that we are looking at a character in a specific point in their story,
Right. Okay.
right? So it's not about trying to make everything for every Luke Skywalker ever.
Right.
It's about what is this Luke Skywalker? What is he doing? You would never want to take, farm boy Luke Skywalker
Hmm.
and allow him to have the stance card of Jedi Knight Luke Skywalker. Wouldn't make any sense. He's not at that point in the story. He doesn't know these things, right?
Right.
So again, everything about these characters, sometimes it will bleed over, right? You'll see things because characters are growing and evolving. It doesn't mean they lose their own skills, but for sure, there's that narrative integrity of this is an encapsulation of this character at this point.
Mm.
And if that's not your favorite point of the character story, Shatterpoint is amazing because someday we'll hopefully get to that point that you really love.
Yeah.
Right? We'll get to that version of the character that excites you the most, and that character will be an encapsulation of that. They will have their own unique abilities and their unique stances and everything goes with it.
Okay.
Going back to combat, the last big thing about the stance cards that people will notice when they see the card itself is that so the stance card tells you your attack dice, your defense dice, and then there's a couple more things. It tells you your expertises, which are important to the dice, and that'll get covered in the combat thing. But basically, there's the diamond results on the defense and the attack dice that people have been trying to figure out are the arrows that point to something or whatever. They're known as expertise results. And you basically add up the number of expertise results, and then you go to your expertise chart, and your chart tells you what bonuses you get. So typically they'll add like successes or certain results into your full roll.
Okay.
Sometimes they'll give you straight damage. Sometimes they do other things.
And that'll allow the dice to be dynamic depending on the character that's rolling them.
Yeah. And it really allows for the character to show through or the weapon style to show through because the expertise charts are unique per weapon that the character uses. So, for example, if you look at the Mandalorians, the super commandos have a flamethrower, and the flamethrower is super aggro. So it's very different from like their little blaster pistol, which does different things. And it can also showcase like how a character uses the same weapon in different results. So Clone Captain Rex uses his DC 17s for both melee and ranged attacks, but his charts are different because he's utilizing them in different forms and styles.
I see.
So expertise was a really cool thing that we honed in on that allowed us to do very unique things with the characters by utilizing expertise results and how characters build those up throughout their dice rolling. The other big thing that obviously drives everything with combat is the combat tree. And this takes up most of the card, and it's composed of a bunch of little boxes, and they're connected by these little lines. And effectively in Shatterpoint, instead of dealing damage like you would in Legion, where one success equals 1 point of damage, in Shatterpoint, we use a combat tree system, which is one success equals one step on your combat tree. So going left to right, you start at your leftmost box, and then you get to tree down that many slots. And each box has its own unique set of abilities. Some of them deal damage. Some of them let you shove the opposing character and follow up so you can get them off of points. Some of them put out special conditions. Some of them allow you to activate your abilities for free.
So
There's
when
a
I attack
whole range of
you,
things.
if I do damage to you, you are actually deciding where the damage goes on that tree. So it's not me saying, "Oh, I shot your left arm, you're disarmed." You're saying, "No, no, you shot me, and now I'm angry, and now I'm getting more
No,
powerful
no.
potentially, right?" Or
So
am
the
I
way that you determine your combat tree. So let's
right?
say that you attack my character and you get 4 successes. So you would look at your character's stance card. You
Oh,
would look
I
at
get
their
the
stat.
bonuses for
Their
shooting.
Yep.
Okay,
So this is how you determine what your attack does.
okay,
So you would go, okay, I got 4 successes, so I get to go 4 steps down my tree. So you start at your leftmost result, and then you would say, okay, I do that, and then let's say it branches like this.
okay.
So you have a box here and a box here, like a top and a bottom box.
Mm.
You get to pick which of those boxes you're going to do.
Okay.
And then from there, you go to the next result, right? So each of those boxes has unique things in it that you do everything in the box, and then you move to the next box.
Okay.
It will make sense.
Once we get the article
It
and
really,
we can see them a little
once
bit more
you've
clarity.
seen the article
yeah.
with the stance card,
Sure.
and then especially in the combat card, it really starts to clarify. But the point of the whole thing is that every character, when it succeeds at combat, does its own unique things.
Okay.
So combat isn't always about attacking, right? And the best example of this is kind of if you compare Darth Maul or Lord Maul, excuse me, from the core box to, let's say, General Obi-Wan from the expansion pack.
Mhm.
Maul's combat trees are super damage focused. Like, he just wants to eliminate you. So he's got a lot of damage results. He doesn't really do a whole lot of other stuff. Like, he doesn't shove you around off of points. He doesn't lay out a lot of like different conditions and stuff. He's just mostly about the murder.
Yeah. Okay. I love it. About the
You
murder.
look at you look at Obi-Wan's Form 3, and we know that Form 3 is a very defensive. It's about wearing down your opponent until you see the crack, and then you hit them at the critical moment. So his combat results are very, like, they're not particularly focused on damage. They're focused on putting you at a disadvantageous position. So he has a lot of shoves. He can like manipulate you around the table. He can either knock you into Narnia, as we like to call it, and get you way far away from the action, so you have to waste actions coming back. Or he can position you so his other troops can be more advantageous to attack you. He gets to lay out some conditions. He gets to recover and heal himself a lot. So, like, he keeps himself going as he wears you down. So the combat system really, it emphasizes the character. Again, it emphasizes the story.
Oh, very cool.
And for us, that was such a big part of Star Wars combat in general. That's where a lot of our like game design and development went into. And it's the thing that really, I think, stands out to make Shatterpoint very unique.
Before we started this, I was talking to you a little bit about like my hopes and dreams of being able to mix and match Marvel Crisis Protocol and Shatterpoint, and I think the more you explain it, I'm realizing just how different these games are going to be, and that might be a little more tricky to do than I had initially thought.
You would basically have to rewrite the characters at whole cloth, I think.
Yeah.
One way or the other.
I'm sure somebody is going to homebrew like cards to, crisscross the two, like Star Wars Crisis Protocol cards or something like that. I think people have already done that a little bit with Legion, but I have a question about the Force. We got a recent article that was talking about our Force points. It looks like Force points are typically on your primary characters only. Although they said very cleverly typically, because that leaves the door open for expansion. But it seems like Force are only kind of like assigned at the beginning of the game, and then they're like a currency that you have to spend. Like, is Force refreshed in the middle of the game, or is that just like this is what you start with? Don't use it all up too quickly.
So I think in the article that comes next, which probably will post before this, it does talk about that.
Okay.
But to kind of sum it up, and maybe the article doesn't say this, and this will be the first place people will learn about it. My bad memory is your benefit, potentially.
Excellent.
Is when you refresh your order deck, you also refresh your Force.
I see.
So every time you reshuffle all of your orders, you will refresh all of your Force. So your pool doesn't last the entire game, but it is pretty limited because you have to go through all of your activations before you can get it back.
So you have to still be judicious, but at least it's not unrecoverable if you make a mistake.
And the other big thing about Force, which I is kind of referenced in the article but not explicitly stated, and I think we've clarified in a couple of spots. Like, force in this game is not about a character's ability to manipulate the force. Okay. The force in this game is about the cosmic kind of galactic entity of the force. The fact that the force is an energy field that binds and surrounds all living things, and it has an influence on them, right? Even if you can't sense the force, even if you're not force sensitive, the force still has the ability to push you in different directions, right? It's kind of the quintessential like plot armor for the characters as they move through their stories.
So will General Grievous have a force value? Was going to be my next question.
So every primary unit has a force value.
Okay.
It has nothing. It has no bearing on whether or not you're trained in the force's use. What it really represents is when you're in a critical situation, when you are fighting in a Shatterpoint, how much influence, how much presence does the force have in terms of like being with you? So General Grievous has force points that he brings into the thing. A Han Solo as a primary unit would have force that they bring to the game. Now, obviously, there is some variability between that, right? You've seen on the Anakin Skywalker card that he has 4 force points. 4 is one of the highest values that you'll ever see in the game. But that's because Anakin is so important.
Yeah, that's true.
That the force has a strong presence when he's around. It has nothing really to do with his ability to use it in terms of like how much he brings to the table. It's the fact that like when he shows up, the force is strong.
Yeah,
like,
he's got that gravitas. Yeah.
Yeah, his moments are very important.
Okay.
Now the trade-off to that is that, you know, what you'll see, the other thing too is that using force points is not restricted to just people who can manipulate the force as like a Jedi or a Sith, right?
Okay.
We interpret force in this game again as the force influencing the characters to do smart things, to go the extra mile, to be in the right spot at the right time, right? So the characters, it's the easy way to kind of interpret it is that, oh, the character spends the force. But that's not really what the game experience is implying. What the game experience is implying is that the will of the force, which you as the player control,
I see,
is expending its influence to put these characters in the right spots so that the right things will happen, right? The results will occur. So the clones, the 501st clones, they're I forgot the name of the ability, but they have an ability that allows them to move and hunker. I think it's defensive maneuver. It costs a force to use.
Okay.
So if you want to use that, you have to exhaust a force. That's not them using the force to make that move.
Right.
That's them responding to the influence of the force and basically making the right play to get into position so that they can do whatever they need to do so that the Shatterpoint goes according to fate. Right?
And that answers
so
kind of a follow-up.
The plan goes according to destiny.
Yeah, that answers kind of the follow-up question of, can only people who bring force to the game, they're the only ones that you can activate force to use their abilities? And so it sounds like, hey, a lot of people are going to have these potential abilities. So, you know, you just want to make sure you bring a commander that gives you enough to be able to do that.
Pretty much every unit in the game will have at least one ability, if not more, that will require the expenditure of force.
Excellent. Very cool.
So when you look at that total force pool, it's like, one of the reasons the article says, are you going to spend it all very early, or are you going to save some so that you can spread it out over the course of your activation deck, basically, before it refreshes, is because Anakin can spend a lot of force to do a lot of cool things.
I can see that, yeah.
But if you do that, then all of your other characters are basically going to be stuck with their 2 basic actions and not much else.
You know,
knowing how to manage that resource is really important.
That wouldn't be too out of character for Anakin to just kind of charge ahead.
It wouldn't be.
Yeah. So, you know, speaking of, like, if Anakin wanted to charge ahead, you know, we've talked about the activation cards, you know, that was in a recent article. You know, you're drawing a card, you have the option to play it or set it in reserve, which I thought was very interesting. And then there's also a Shatterpoint card, which is, you know, for all intents and purposes, basically a wild card that can allow you to activate a character of your choice, even a character that maybe you've already activated. That seems very interesting to me. Are you able to put your Shatterpoint card in reserve and kind of save for that double activation?
Not in the same way. Okay. So you can reserve the Shatterpoint card, But when you reserve the Shatterpoint card, you flip over the top card of your order deck, and then you shuffle the Shatterpoint card into the remainder of the cards.
Oh, I see. So you're putting it back in there, but you're not. It's going to be. It sounds like it's possible, but it's going to be very very hard to get maybe like a triple activation of the same character. You know, if they
Like
happen to be
everything
both at
has
the
to, you got to
bottom.
get real lucky.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
you got to get real lucky for that to happen.
all right, so the game kind of
We start.
yeah, the game kind of tries to keep it a little bit more balanced so that that's not as easy to set up.
You know, the interesting thing about the way the game plays, and one of the things that I've really loved, having been playtesting and playing it for many years now, as it's evolved, but especially in kind of its final form, because now we've moved to the point where, like, once you get to that rules lock point and it goes off to print, you know it's not going to change. So now you're getting to really like delve into the game.
Right.
Um, I've seen times where a character, where like somebody has flipped a primary, flipped a Shatterpoint, shuffled, flipped a primary, flipped a Shatterpoint, and been
that's
like,
wild.
this was the worst thing that could have ever happened to me.
Maybe because you're overextended at that point, and now all of a sudden you lose your commander,
Because
right? Or
the way in which scoring works, which happens every turn, and the way in which the objectives are placed, having Anakin go and really beat up some fools doesn't score you points necessarily. It doesn't move like if he's on one side of the board and the objective you have to get to score your big bonus points is on the other side of the board. The last thing you want is for him to go.
I see.
You might need those 501st to go, and that's where the Shatterpoint becomes really interesting, because I think initially when you start playing the game at first, you're like, I always want to use my Shatterpoint on my big names, my big primary units, right? Because they do the most. They're the most exciting.
That sounds the most fun, yeah.
But as you start to play the game more and more, and you start to see situations, I've watched people use Shatterpoints now in many games where they're like, I'm going to activate this wounded unit of clones, and they're going to go and they're going to win me the game, or they're going to put me in a position to win the game. And so there's that dark side allure of power and the temptation to make, to be like, I'm going to do this. And it's like, well, maybe that's not the best choice.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I've certainly seen it the other way, right? I've seen back-to-back activations where it has totally mattered. And you've just been like, please stop drawing Maul, because I am done.
Well, he would probably be one of the better characters to do that. I mean, if he's the way scoring works, and it's going to lead into, because I want to talk about struggle as kind of one of the last things we talk about in this, because I still have some questions there. But my guess is that you're going to be scoring, as far as pacing goes, like you're going to be scoring fairly quickly. I imagine a lot of games of Shatterpoint won't have a player get tabled. Like how often are characters, from your experience playing, in play testing and the games that you've played, is it common to have like the majority of your characters actually get killed, or do a lot of games end with most of the characters still on the board, kind of still fighting?
So lethality in Shatterpoint was probably one of the hardest things that we dealt with throughout the design and development of the game. Because you want players to have the opportunity to use the characters that they spent all this time hobbying and painting and super love on the table, and you want to see those characters get to do their things, right? And so, and also just the theme and the narrative of the game, it really led us to a place where it was like, having somebody get removed from the tabletop should be rare.
Okay. Yeah.
It should be difficult. And in all of my time playing Shatterpoint, I think I've seen a primary unit get removed from the table once.
Really? Okay. That's really insightful, because I know
it's
with other games I've played, like Marvel Crisis Protocol. I keep coming back to that because, again, great game. I see some similarities between these two. I learned very quickly that Marvel Crisis Protocol even was not all about just murdering each other. It was very objective based, and you can do a little bit of murder, but it's but not at the expense of not doing objectives. And it seems like you took a similar path with this one.
It is similar, and then also very different, just in terms of how the things work. It's in Marvel Crisis Protocol, you definitely see characters get removed and start getting KO'd, like in that round 2, round 3, right at the culmination of the game. In Shatterpoint, you'll see supporting units will definitely drop off as the struggles commence and they go. But it's still difficult, and again, because the focus, and I think it comes back to the focus like we talked about with the combat, right? A lot of combat results don't actually deal damage. They're actually more about positioning or putting status effects on things, which means that you don't have a lot of characters that just can one-shot something off the table.
Right.
Additionally, the way in which the health and the durability work, stamina and durability on the stat card, when a character takes all the damage it can't count for objectives anymore, but it doesn't get removed from the table. In fact, it gets to keep going until it has injuries on it equal to its durability, and then at the end of an activation, if a character has injuries equal to its durability, it gets removed. So it gets one last hurrah.
You get that. You get that thematic, like I won't fail you, Commander. Yeah.
And so really, the goal in Shatterpoint, kind of the primary play pattern is you want to deal damage and wound characters because it removes them from scoring potential. Okay. And because a character doesn't clear a wound until it activates again, that can be a long time, depending on how the order deck goes and all this other stuff.
Right.
But you're not necessarily looking at damage as a way to remove miniatures from the table, at least not super fast. You can do it, and it's definitely strong to do in late stages of the game, especially in that third struggle. Having a couple more like miniatures on the table compared to your opponent can be a huge like swing. But it's not going to be, you're not going to be like, I'm going to table you.
Okay.
We have yet to see the Shatterpoint force that can be like, I'm not going to worry about the objectives. I'm just going to remove you from the board.
Challenge
because
accepted.
Intentionally we made it very difficult to do so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let us know.
Intentionally and by design.
Yeah. Right? Now, if you're watching this like 2 years in the future, let us know if you're able to actually table your opponent consistently. Yeah. I'm curious.
We've certainly, and that's one of the exciting things about working on these games, right? Is that we're talking about an environment in which, for everyone who's listening to me jabber for way too long, probably, you're just going to start exploring the initial design stuff, all the things that were worked on first. For us internally, we're 3 years ahead, basically. We're looking pretty far ahead. We're into that Galactic Civil War era stuff. We're talking about other things, right? We're adding more and more Clone Wars characters still.
That sounds exciting.
So we've certainly seen, like the growth and evolution of different things. There are now characters that they do murder a bit more than the original cast of characters, because the original cast of characters is more balanced to providing a full game experience and kind of expressing the game in the way we want. But you start to see the tentacles creep out, right? And you get these different kind of builds and opportunities where you can maximize certain things as more options become available.
Yeah.
But, interestingly enough, like as we were going through the design process, and again, kind of coming back to how difficult lethality was for us to necessarily figure out in the game, we had several conversations and a couple of times where you just couldn't eliminate any characters. Like you could wound them, you could remove them from being effective scorers, but the idea that you could just defeat somebody outright was gone. And we didn't like that very much because it kind of like took the teeth out of some characters that really wanted to do that. Right. And it's interesting and exciting to be able to remove things.
It sounds like you settled on a pretty good balance point of being able to do it, but it not being necessarily the main way to go.
We definitely hope so. And again, I think one of the really exciting parts about, it's fun to be in this position where, everyone in the community is anticipating what the game is and what the game will bring and what will it fulfill from what I want versus what the rules will actually be and all this stuff. There's all this dialogue and these crazy theories, and sometimes people get things really right, and sometimes people are like way off base, but they have interesting thoughts. From our side, we know what the game is, but what I don't know is what players will do with the game once they have it.
Yeah.
Because we talk about this a lot. No matter how much we play test, no matter how many years we spend developing and designing and perfecting a game, by the time it hits the general community, they will blow away the amount of effort and time we've spent on that game in maybe a matter of months.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's an exciting anticipation in that. Who's going to unlock it? Who's going to figure it out? Right? You said challenge accepted. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, I think
maybe you find it.
Well, the challenge is the fun too, because trying to get to that point might also open your eyes to a whole different strategy that you hadn't considered before. So you talked
Yeah,
about
and
the
I
third
think
struggle too.
Mhm.
I want to, and I didn't mean to cut you off, but I want to get to that
No, no, go.
before we wrap things up. But that third struggle, we talked about that you have this struggle meter. You're moving it back and forth. You're building momentum, and so the article talks about it as it's kind of like a tug of war, and we're going to be doing kind of best two of three out of these, which I think it's just a great, balanced mechanic, a way to score objectives and to kind of keep the scenario sort of going, where if you lose the first one, you're not out of it because now you have a little bit of a catch-up mechanic. But one of the things that I read in your article talking about this was that when the first struggle is over, the next one starts, you keep like wounds on characters, you keep tokens and things like that. But as you're building momentum, does the momentum stay or does that get reset between struggles?
So the momentum gets erased as well.
Okay.
Um, so you basically like the scoreboard resets, the objectives reset, and everything else stays the same.
Okay.
So you effectively every struggle starts with the exact same position of the rope, right?
Okay.
Like each side starts the way it is, and then you start to generate more momentum and you start to swing things back and forth. And that's really important because as the longer the game goes, the shorter the rope gets, right? And man, like if figuring out combat was a challenge and lethality was a challenge, I've never worked on a game from the ground up where determining scenario and objective and what the actual like win condition of the game is has been simple.
Okay.
We went through, I don't even know how many different iterations trying to figure out like how to get what we wanted out of the game, which was this really dynamic and kind of chaotically paced experience that really challenged players' tactics. That the thing that I really love about Shatterpoint and where it wound up is that, again, we'll go back to our Legion comparison, right? If you look at Legion, again, we're talking about a macro, strategic, and tactical game. I build my army. I know what that army wants to do, and it's my job to command that army to do the thing in the best way I can while my opponent tries to mess me up, right? Because my opponent is going to be exerting force on my plan. So I have to react to that, but I'm still trying to do my plan to the best of the ability because that's how I'm going to get the maximum value out of what I've built.
Sure.
In Shatterpoint, you can go in with a plan, but the second you flip over that first order card and it's not the character you wanted, you're like, well, here we go. Yeah. Shatterpoint, instead of the questions really being asked by the interaction necessarily between the players, one of its big question marks is like, okay, here's what you have. What do you do with it? So there's a lot of little mini puzzles in the game where you look at things and you're like, okay, I flipped over this character or this unit. They can do this. How do I maximize their turn? Okay. Because I only have so much control. I can only reserve one card. I only have one Shatterpoint. And your opponent's kind of playing the same game, but you're both answering those questions within the same context of the objectives and what you have to do, right? And then you do things to your opponent, like you put wounds on characters and you put conditions on characters. And that forces those questions to become more strategic, more tactical, and more deterministic. Like, well, I have this character, but they're pinned and they're strained and they're disarmed and they're exposed. And I don't know what to do because they're basically like shut down, but I have to do something with them. So how can I work my way out of this? And so it's a very different experience, a very different flavor. And so when it came to like the struggle and how that stuff works and how the objectives work, we wanted something where, again, the game was asking you questions that you had to answer in the moment. And the way in which the struggles transition and the fact that the board state with your miniatures and your wounds and all that stuff, like everything stays the same, but now where you're like, you have the perfect position and you've totally dominated the plus sign, right? Because you have your 9 objectives and maybe you got the plus.
Right.
And, Crabbok comes in and he's masterful and he just kicks my ass. Like,
oh my goodness. All right.
You just blow me out. You blow me out. Like you pull the rope all the way and I'm just like, there's no way I can win. And then all of a sudden we draw struggle 2 and I look at it and I'm like, the new struggle has 2 points like over here.
Right. They showed this in the article.
Over here. And now I'm like, well, you did a great job getting that plus sign, Crabbok, but you failed to realize the most important tactic in war, which is to not start a land war in Asia. And I have all these points. And I flip over, and so I choose that one, and now all of a sudden I start first scoring because you won on your turn. Now it's my turn, and now I jump out to an early lead because I've positioned myself in a way, or I've been lucky enough to be in a position where I can do that, right?
Sure.
And that's some of the comeback mechanic, but it's also the interesting question. So as players develop their kind of like understanding of the game and the strategy and the tactical like requirements of the game, you start to realize that, okay, at some point you have to decide, am I going to continue to fight to win this struggle, or am I going to just let the struggle go and put myself in a position where maybe I can capitalize on the next one?
Okay.
And I think that's really exciting, and it's very interesting. And the other thing that the momentum stuff does is it gives you ways to like jump ahead, you know, and it also puts a clock on the game. So there's a number of ways to earn momentum. I don't think the article really went into them, but
it sounded
way
like
is by wounding
combat
characters.
can be a way to earn momentum.
So yeah, so we can go through like the main ones right
Sure.
now. When you wound a character, you gain a momentum.
Okay.
So wounding characters, again, really important. Gives you a momentum. And a momentum is effectively a permanent victory point, right? Because all you have to do is get to the end of your track.
Okay. Yeah.
So every momentum point I put on there, it's just shortening the amount of victory points I have to score on my turn by one.
Right. So I don't have to rush to the objective right away. I can just be building momentum and then waiting. All right, now it's time. Now I'll take it.
You could try. I mean, you have to remember that your opponent's also scoring every one of their turns. So
That's
you have
true.
to make sure that you're kind of keeping it in balance, right?
Right.
But yeah, you can forego an objective to get a momentum if you think that long term the momentum means more to you. So every time you wound a character, you get a momentum. That's great. Go have fun with combat. And there are characters like Anakin Skywalker who might get additional momentum when he wounds important characters, because that's what Anakin Skywalker wants to do. He wants to go fight the general of the army and like win the day, right?
Absolutely. That's pretty thematic.
So there are ways to generate more momentum through combat, and those are tied to certain characters and other things. If you score on your turn, but you don't pull the struggle tracker across the 0 line, so you don't like Crabbok has four on the struggle. You scored 4 points. It's 4 over here, and I only scored 2, and it's on your 2. I get a momentum because I'm getting desperate.
Okay.
Right? Like my need to win the struggle, my situation is getting worse. So my forces are naturally building momentum. They're fighting harder. So you get a momentum. And then the last way that you gain a momentum typically is if a player scores and the struggle tracker goes to 0. So let's say you have 2 victory points currently. I score on my turn, I score 2, and it goes to 0. We both gain a momentum.
Oh, just the clock is ticking down. The dynamite, the fuse is getting shorter and shorter. Yeah. Okay.
So what you'll see is, especially in like the opening struggle, the first player will go. Now the downside to being the first player, the balancing factor to being the first player is that the first player's first turn, they can't score victory points. They can claim objectives, but they don't score points for them. And then after that, you score every turn. So typically in that first struggle, what you'll see is that the players will kind of fight back and forth, right? One player will pull it 2 to their side. The other player will pull it 2 back. Mm-hmm. The momentum will get added, or maybe they'll get 3, but it's pretty tight. And the momentum will keep building until you get to a point where like one player is just like, I got you, because I will score and I will wound a character, and now that will put me in the win.
And maybe I know you're going to do that, so I spread out to try to cover future objectives and set myself up for that second one, right?
And yeah, and so you might be like, well, I'm in a position where I don't think I'm going to win this fight back and forth. So maybe I will focus on wounding a character.
Yeah.
And I'll forget the objective. I'm going to wound that character over there because I know that they've already been drawn and you still have a couple cards left in your deck. So they can't score on the next struggle and I can.
Okay.
And I already have a character over there, right? So it becomes this really interesting puzzle that you're always solving and you're looking at. And the fact that the struggle changes and there are 3 struggle cards per phase. So there are 3 possibilities, but struggle 2 and 3 have 2 maps. So now you're talking about 6 per phase. So you can kind of know what the layout will be, but you don't know which card is in there. So you're working with imperfect information, right? So you always have to plan for like, well, what if it's this? What if it's that? Mm-hmm. Then the struggle 2 and 3 and the mission pack that comes in the core set throw an extra wrinkle in it. because there's a priority objective in those next two and three, and the priority token moves every round based on a random die roll.
Okay.
And it's worth 2 points.
Oh goodness, yeah. So that's another great way
So
to
all of
score.
a sudden, so all of a sudden, it's like we're going to chase the priority token, but what happens when the priority token never comes to your side? Are you going to go fight your opponent off of that point? Or are you just going to be like, well, hopefully it doesn't wind up there next round because it's going to move, so I just can't score it this round.
Okay, yeah.
And you're kind of like, you have to start deciding, like, where's the chase?
All right.
So it's,
it seems like it's going to be a lot more different than I was expecting, which is going to be fun because it's really exciting to learn a whole new game. And so I'm really looking forward to it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Like,
you talked a little bit about, you mentioned Legion earlier, which leads me to like one of my closing questions. And of course, I've got to kind of represent some of the other games that I cover. You know, I've got a lot of folks out there who watch that also play Legion, X-Wing, and of course, my beloved Armada. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring those up. A lot of these folks are certainly, you know, have expressed concerns to me, and I've seen on social media that, oh, well, you know, AMG has Star Wars Shatterpoint. Does that mean that it's a death sentence for these other games? And I was curious. I wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe like address some of those concerns, or what would you say to those players? I mean, I've certainly said things, but I think they'd like to hear some thoughts from you on that.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously we have an incredible catalog of games that all are lifestyle games, and they all have like thriving communities, and everybody wants to see more support for their thing, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, you know, the reality is while I would love to give everybody everything they want, that's just not reality, right? So what's important to us is that we maintain and steward the games in the way that works best for not only their communities, but also for the studio, so that we can continue to make things for all of them, and make sure that those products continue to exist for as long as possible. And there are going to be times where one game, like a Shatterpoint that's new, is going to get more of the focus and attention, right? Because it needs to, so that it can launch properly and it can go forward. There's also just looking at things in terms of, you know, X-Wing is over 10 years old now. So it's got a second edition. It's got a lot of development in it. And, you know, it's great to release new things, but you also have to make sure those new things are compelling and interesting, you know, that players actually want them. Because if you just throw out a bunch of things to have a bunch of things, to me, that's not healthy, right? It's at best, it's kind of pandering. And that's not our goal. Our goal is to make sure that we're providing high value content for whatever we do. And so there is a life cycle issue and consideration, right? If you've covered a lot of the things, then you also have to wait for compelling things to show up. And then when they do, you know, you talk about timelines. And again, our timelines are very long, so we're always looking in the future. And the challenge and the responsibility that we have as a studio is to balance all of those things. So, you know, very early on, we looked at what was available to us and what had been transferred over when we took ownership of the games and the stewardship. And we said, you know, honestly, in full transparency, Armada is going to sit for a bit, because there's nothing that we have currently, and there's a lot of things that we have to consider when we go forward with it. And, you know, we want to be as open and honest with the communities as we can with that stuff.
Yeah, and that can be a double-edged sword sometimes, because if you don't do it, then you have the people like me who would be like, why aren't they doing anything? And then when you do it, and then it's like, why did they do that? And so I'm guilty of the hypocrisy myself of being going through the whole range of emotions. But then you guys turned around and gave us Rapid Reinforcements 1, which was really cool. And by the way, loved that. And just for what it's worth, would love to see some more of that someday. Wink, wink, nod, nod.
Well, I mean, we definitely titled it 1, meaning that there's at least one more. That's on the way.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear.
But yeah, so and I get it, right? Like I talked about one of the amazing things about my job and the thing that we really enjoy, even our studio mantra of spreading the passion and the enjoyment of these games to other people. The communities around them are passionate. We love these things. We pour our time and our mental energy into them. When it comes to games like, in fact, all of them, I've seen amazing repaints and paint jobs for people's customized X-Wings, their Armadas, but especially with, the games that don't come out of the box ready to go. And you have to learn how to paint. You get to learn how to paint. I always hate saying have to, but you do have to put them together before you can use them. I don't think many people would allow you
Yeah.
to just drop a pile of parts on the table
It's
and be like, let's
it's pretty
play.
hard to
Like,
do.
no,
You can
no, no,
just
no.
put the bases
You
down
gotta
and yeah.
you gotta at least assemble that. But you get to assemble it. You get to master painting. You get to then express your version of Star Wars, right? It's funny to me sometimes we talked about like mixing and matching characters. Well, I've seen some amazing like clone units, some rebel units, some empire units that have been painted that there's no canonical reference for that. But they look amazing. That person took the Star Wars galaxy and made it their own.
Right.
And boy, isn't that an amazing thing that all of these games get to provide to us. So you can't look at any of those communities. We can't look as a studio at any of those communities and say, boy, we don't understand why they're so insistent that they get things, why they're so insistent that their game get attention. I get it.
Yeah.
And if we could, we would give you all the things that are possible. But there are many realities to the situation. And what our job is, the hard part of our job is looking at, okay, how can we give the games what they need? How can we continue to support the games and do so in a way that gives valuable, meaningful content and isn't just putting stuff out? Because as cool as it sounds for people to say, well, if they could release like 50 different things for X-Wing in a year if they just tried.
Yeah.
If
it would be that easy,
four of
wouldn't
those
it?
things are worth anything, right? If only 4 of those things are compelling, and we just, all of the other ones are just like whatevers, we just start grabbing content. We're like, here we go. We're just going to do this because it exists.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Would you rather have one,
because now you're
one or
looking
two
at,
really good releases?
Yeah. And so that's, is that the answer that everybody wants to hear? Absolutely not. Is it the right answer? It's subjective, and it's the answer that I'm going to give you is the way in which I think is the best and most healthy way forward. And you can agree or disagree with me, and I'm totally cool with that.
Sure.
But at the very least, I can give you as much of a viewpoint into the wise and the transparent ways in which we do things.
Okay.
So
well, I mean, I appreciate it. It's sometimes these answers aren't, like you said, they're not always everybody's favorite answer, but I also appreciate you being frank.
Yeah, and so is Shatterpoint the death knell of any of these games? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
We would have never released a new game if we thought it would come at the expense of something else, right?
Right.
Does that, but the correlation or the idea that Shatterpoint means less for something else is also not necessarily true, because again, we're analyzing all of this stuff in terms of what's available, what makes sense, what brings value to the line, and then what brings overall value to the studio so that we can continue to make cool games and to support the communities in all the ways we can. And, when it comes to certain games, that might mean that they're going to see less stuff, but hopefully it's very compelling things, Well,
I think I don't think anybody would be surprised to see, a huge focus on Shatterpoint this year, and probably even into next year. I mean, it's the newest thing. You have to have a big launch to get a brand new game out there.
And obviously, like launching a game and stuff like that, you get marketing focus and excitement, and it's always hard to see a new baby show up.
Sure.
Right? There's that older sibling jealousy of like they used to pay all the attention to me, and now there's this thing. But at the end of the day, yes, there are more amazing games in our catalog, but they're not coming at the expense of anything that we would have done, right?
Sure.
Like the analysis is always there of, okay, this is where we want to go with Armada, with X-Wing, with Legion, Crisis Protocol, with Shatterpoint. How do we do that? And can we do that?
Sure.
And is it coming at the expense of any of these other games or any of the things that we think would add value to them? And if it is, then we have to have serious conversations about that. Okay. It's all those different like analyses and propositions and stuff. And the goal is that we find that sweet spot where everyone's not getting everything they want, but we're servicing the communities in the way that's going to make them the healthiest and the most compelling, going forward. And that can mean a lot of things. And those answers aren't necessarily always, again, like I said with Armada, right? The answer there was, we're not in a position to provide meaningful, valuable content. And so we have to be transparent about that.
Yeah.
And
I think, and in
that's not an
retrospect, I
answer.
think that was the best decision you could have made at the time. It certainly hasn't been. It's certainly like, so what was the people were saying for a long time, like, oh, is Armada dead now? I'm like, it's absolutely not dead. It's still getting reprints. They're having worlds. All of these games are getting worlds at Adepticon. So I'm just kind of doubling down now on a lot of the things that I've been saying for a while. I'm like, these games are absolutely not dead. I mean, Imperial Assault, people still play that. There's lots of games. I mean, gosh, Battlestar Galactica, the board game that doesn't get reprinted anymore, but people still play it all the time. As long as you still play it and have fun with it, and there's a thriving community, which all of these games have communities that are growing still. So, I don't know. That's just my endorsement for what you guys are saying, that they're still going. I have one kind of closing question for you here, and this one is, it's Shatterpoint related, because it's like, what is your favorite Star Wars fight? Whether it's a lightsaber duel, or maybe a larger fight, or just a one-on-one. Like, do you have, if you don't have a favorite off the top of your head, like one of your top three?
Wow, that's a tough question.
I mean, there's a couple on the box art right there, which were obviously were some of the inspirations for the.
There are. I think one of the best lightsaber duels, maybe the best lightsaber duel, is the season 7 face-off between Ahsoka and Maul.
That's a very good one. Yeah.
The fight choreography in that, the emotional impact, the story, like, I think that's like pinnacle Star Wars.
Yeah.
For all, like, if you want to tick all the boxes, I feel like that one does. If you want to talk about, if you want to just talk about, like, what's the best narrative duel, it's probably Luke versus Vader in Return of the Jedi.
That's
because that one's, it doesn't have a lot of fight choreography, it doesn't have a lot of flash, but the emotional weight and impact and the story that when they clash comes out is incredible.
Yeah.
And then I think my favorite, like, fight scene, because it includes my favorite Star Wars character, being the biggest badass in all of Star Wars, is probably Cad Bane when he fights Obi-Wan and Quinlan Vos.
Oh,
and just owns them for most of the fight. Like, I love that fight, because it's like, here are these two Jedi, here's Cad Bane, you're like, he doesn't stand a chance, and yet he's just smarter than them.
Sure.
And I think that's brilliant, right? Because again, talking about everything we've discussed with, like, why Shatterpoint is Shatterpoint, and what the point of Shatterpoint was, why I was so excited to get to design it and then get to develop it with the amazing team at Atomic Mass Games, is you learn more about who Cad Bane is and what he's capable of in that fight than in every single line of dialogue he gives. He can tell you all he wants about how hardcore and bad he is. But when you watch him, like, go toe-to-toe with two Jedi and get the better of them for most of the fight, and only lose because it's, an animated show about heroes and the heroes have to win, even though he escapes at the end, like, and he still gets away.
Yeah, he did some flexing.
That's incredible, right?
Speaking of Cad Bane, what do you think the chances are that we might see him in Shatterpoint at some point?
I'd say, based on my desk, super high.
Okay, all right. Well, there you go, folks. Place your bets. All right. I know I have held you for quite a long time, and so I appreciate you spending a ridiculous amount of time talking with me about Shatterpoint, about Star Wars, about all these other games. It's been fantastic. I want to thank you so much, Will. Thanks to Atomic Mass Games, and I'm really looking forward to this. So thank you so much.
I'm glad I finally got to visit the Bridge of the Star Destroyer.
It's where we do our stuff. It can take us anywhere. That's what they say. And to everybody else watching,
it's definitely roomier than I thought. For sure.
It's comfortable. Well, we cleared out the crew, so they're not there. Usually it's a little noisier.
It's fair.
There's usually gonna be some Sith walking around, choking somebody. But I'm like, we can't choke Will. So we've got a
lot of pacing. I don't understand how any work gets, like, how would anyone get their work done with their boss just pacing back and forth above them.
They
It's
get
ridiculous.
the truth is, little known secret about Sith vessels, they only give them 30 minutes a day to storm the bridge, but that's when the cameras come
It's
out.
like, yeah,
Yeah, then
like
they're
yard time. That's
yeah,
it.
exactly. It's
Otherwise,
like we
meditation
don't
chamber
expect any
only.
work to get done during this time, but then everybody goes back to work. Yeah. All right. Well,
Makes
that's
sense.
that's
Makes
gonna
sense.
do everything. If you guys want to learn more, I'll have a link down below. You can check out all the latest articles and the information for Star Wars Shatterpoint over at atomicmassgames.com. Also, you guys should follow them on social media. You guys have a fantastically expanded your social media presence, and it's doing really great. Like the Twitters and the Facebooks and the Instagrams and all of that has been really a great source of the latest articles that maybe I haven't even seen yet at the time of recording this video, because the way timelines work out, it's pretty cool. So thank you guys for watching, and thanks for everybody. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and may the Force be with you. Have a fantastic day.